Shadows in the ancient world were not merely empty darkness. They were carefully crafted spaces filled with monsters designed by master artists of terror. This video will show you the hidden blueprints behind these creations, revealing how our ancestors weaponized imagination to build civilizations. You will learn the 5 core design principles ancient cultures used to turn abstract fears into some of history's most enduring monsters. Why do these ancient beasts, from the multi-headed hydra to the world-circling serpent, still hold such power over us today? What does the specific shape of a monster tell us about the society that feared it? By the end, you will never look at a myth the same way again. What part of the human mind makes a well-designed monster so unforgettable? A churning sea needs a storm to give it form. In the same way, the deep-seated fears of ancient civilizations required a physical shape to be understood. Before a monster could be designed, the raw material of human anxiety had to be gathered. Picture a world without meteorology to explain a hurricane, without medicine to understand a plague. Unexplained phenomena were not just mysteries, they were active threats with no clear cause. This void of understanding became the fertile soil where monster myths took root. These creatures were far more than scary stories. They were external manifestations of internal anxieties, giving a tangible form to the abstract. An expert in the field, Dr. Elena Voss, explains that monster myths often correlate with societal traumas, acting as cultural coping mechanisms. A society repeatedly ravaged by floods might create a great serpent of the waters. A community suffering from a wasting illness could conjure a ghost that drains the life from the living. This was not random invention. It was a deliberate psychological process. By personifying a threat, a civilization could begin to process the complex emotions surrounding it. How does giving fear a face make it easier to confront? Suddenly, the invisible enemy has a lair you can point to. It has weaknesses you can discover. It has a story you can tell around a fire. This act of creation transformed overwhelming terror into a manageable narrative, a problem that could, in theory, be solved by a hero or appeased by a ritual. This foundational blueprint of the mind, this need to make the unknown known, set the stage for every terrifying form that would soon stalk the ancient world. This first design principle begins with a simple, terrifying twist. Ancient artists did not invent monsters from nothing. They borrowed from the world they knew, creating chimeras by stitching together the most formidable parts of nature. The result was a creature that felt both impossible and unnervingly real. Consider the Egyptian Ammit, the devourer of the dead. This was no simple beast. It possessed the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. To an Egyptian, this was not a random assembly of parts. Each element was a direct reference to the most dangerous animals inhabiting their lifeblood, the Nile River. The crocodile was a stealthy ambush predator. The lion was raw, dominating strength. The hippopotamus, often perceived as docile, was in fact one of the river's most aggressive and deadly inhabitants. By combining these three, the creators of Ammit designed a creature that symbolized every conceivable danger of their natural environment, now fused into a single entity that sat beside the scales of judgment in the afterlife. It was the ultimate embodiment of a moral and physical threat. Far to the east, in Mesopotamia, the Mushasu dragon followed the same terrifying blueprint. This serpentine monster bore the head of a snake, the body of a lion, and the powerful hind legs of an eagle. Each part was a symbol of supreme power in its own domain. The snake represented the hidden, chthonic power of the earth. The lion was the undisputed master of the land. The eagle was the sovereign of the skies. When merged, the Mushasu became a walking representation of total, all-encompassing chaos and dominion, a force that challenged the very order of the cosmos. So why did this method work so profoundly? It taps into a deep-seated human instinct. We are conditioned to recognize and respect the threats posed by a lion's claw or a serpent's bite. But when these recognizable, real-world dangers are fused into a new, unnatural whole, our minds recoil. The familiar becomes twisted, creating a cognitive dissonance that is the very essence of horror. What happens when the river you depend on for life is also the home of a composite nightmare? This symbolic approach grounded these monsters in a tangible reality, making their threat feel immediate, credible, and far more terrifying than any purely imaginary beast could ever be. A beautiful face can hide the most terrifying intentions. This chilling truth lies at the heart of the second design principle, where ancient artists gave their monsters a hauntingly human form. After creating composite beasts from the animal kingdom, the next logical step was to borrow from the one creature whose darkness they knew best, humanity itself. This process of anthropomorphism, of grafting human traits onto monstrous beings, created a new and deeply personal kind of fear. The Greek Gorgons are a masterclass in this unsettling art. At first glance, Medusa and her sisters possessed the familiar, recognizable features of women. But this semblance of humanity was violently corrupted by the writhing nest of serpents that crowned their heads. Their beauty was not a comfort, it was a trap, a lure that made their petrifying gaze all the more shocking. They represented a profound fear of untamed female power, a dread of the evil eye, and the terrifying idea that a single look could steal your life away. The horror was not in something completely alien, but in the human form made alien. This theme of deceptive humanity echoes across the world in the Rakshasas of Hindu mythology. These malevolent beings were masters of illusion, capable of shape-shifting into the forms of friends, family, or trusted leaders. They did not confront you with monstrous roars in the darkness. They infiltrated your home, your community, and your trust. The Rakshasa embodied the ultimate paranoia, the fear that the person standing beside you might be your enemy. This design tapped into a psychological phenomenon we now call the uncanny valley, a primal discomfort we feel when something looks almost human but not quite right. Ancient cultures understood this instinct intuitively. By incorporating human elements, they transformed external monsters into mirrors of our own internal struggles. The monster was no longer just a beast from the wild. It was a representation of betrayal, of hidden malice, of the capacity for evil that might lurk within any human heart. How does seeing a reflection of ourselves in the monster change our relationship with fear? It makes the threat inescapable. You cannot simply run from a danger that wears your own face. This humanizing of horror brought the terror from the distant mountains and deep forests directly into the heart of the village and into the quiet corners of the human mind. But a monster does not need a human face to be terrifying. Sometimes its most frightening feature is its sheer, overwhelming size. This is the third principle, the art of the sublime, where ancient creators used colossal scale to evoke a feeling of awe mixed with pure dread. Imagine a serpent so vast it could wrap its body around the entire world, biting its own tail. This is Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent of Norse mythology. Its enormous form was not just for show. It was a physical representation of the uncontrollable forces of nature and the inescapable grip of cosmic destiny. The very ocean where it dwelled was its domain, and its movements were said to cause cataclysmic tidal waves. It was a living, breathing embodiment of the sea's untamable power, a force so immense that even the gods feared its role in the final battle of Ragnarok. Across the world, Chinese mythology perfected this same principle. Their dragons were not the treasure-hoarding beasts of Western lore. They were colossal, serpentine beings of immense power, revered as much as they were feared. Their long, coiling bodies were believed to control the very weather, commanding the rains, the rivers, and the winds. A dragon's displeasure could mean drought and famine, while its favor could bring life-giving floods to the plains. Their scale made them perfect metaphors for the large-scale disasters that could wipe out entire communities, natural forces that were both essential to life and utterly devastating. So why does this principle of gigantic scale work so effectively on the human psyche? It taps into our most primal fear of being small, vulnerable, and insignificant in a vast, unpredictable universe. A giant monster is a problem you cannot fight with a spear. You cannot outrun an earthquake or reason with a hurricane. The sheer scale of these creatures communicated an unstoppable force, making them walking, breathing symbols of the existential threats our ancestors faced every day. What does our enduring fascination with these colossal beings say about our own place in the cosmos? It reminds us that for all our ingenuity, we are still humbled by the raw, majestic power of the world around us. The most unsettling monsters are not those completely alien to us, but those that feel almost right. We have seen how ancient artists borrowed from animals and humans, creating beings of immense scale. But their fourth design principle was perhaps the most psychologically cunning. They mastered the art of conceptual fusion, stitching together incompatible biological forms to create something that violated the very categories of nature. This process of hybridization generated a deep cognitive dissonance, a mental discomfort that made these creatures feel profoundly wrong. Take the Greek Chimera, a creature so infamous its name became the word for this very concept. It was not just a lion or a goat or a snake. It was a walking contradiction, a lion's head roaring from the front, a goat's body bleating from its middle, and a serpent's tail hissing from its rear. Each part was a familiar, dangerous animal, but their forced union created an unnatural whole. How could such a beast be predicted? What did it eat? Where did it live? Its very existence defied logic, making it unpredictable and unnerving on a fundamental level. This principle was weaponized across cultures. The Persian manticore presented a different kind of fusion. It blended the strategic intelligence of a human mind with the raw, physical power of a lion's body, and then weaponized that combination with the venomous sting of a scorpion's tail. This was not a mere beast. It was a multifaceted threat, a hunter that could outthink you, overpower you, and poison you. It challenged simple understanding, forcing anyone who heard of it to confront a being that broke all the rules. Why is this violation of biological expectations so effective? Our minds are wired to categorize the world. A lion belongs to the savannah, a goat belongs to the pasture, a snake belongs to the grass. When these distinct realms are fused into a single entity, it suggests a world where the known rules no longer apply. The ground beneath your feet, both literal and metaphorical, becomes unstable. This fusion of traits from earth, sky, and water created monsters that seemed capable of anything because they obeyed no natural law. They were living proof of a chaotic universe, amplifying an existential dread far greater than the fear of any single animal. The artistry was in creating a being that our own minds could not comfortably process, ensuring its haunting presence would linger long after the story was told. A monster does not need to be seen to be felt. The fifth and perhaps most insidious design principle mastered by ancient cultures was sensory manipulation, crafting atmospheric dread through sounds, smells, and sensations that bypassed the eyes to strike directly at the psyche. After designing creatures that broke the rules of form and scale, these mythmakers turned to the very air around them, weaponizing the invisible to create a fear that was impossible to locate and even harder to escape. The Slavic vila are a perfect example of this auditory artistry. These forest spirits were not described as grotesque. They were often portrayed as beautiful, ethereal women. Their true weapon was their song, an enchanting melody that drifted through the trees, captivating any traveler who heard it. This was not a roar of terror, but a siren call of allure, playing on the deep-seated fear of seduction and the loss of self-control. To follow the beautiful music was to be led astray, to vanish into the woods forever. The horror was in the willingness to be deceived, a danger that sounded like a gift. In stark contrast, the Celtic banshee used sound for a different, more chilling purpose. Her signature was a mournful, piercing wail heard in the dead of night. This sound carried no allure, only a grim and unavoidable message. The banshee's cry was not the cause of death, but its herald. Her voice was the sound of fate itself, a sensory announcement that tragedy was imminent. To hear it was to know that the invisible threads of destiny had already been cut, making the very air feel heavy with doom. This approach engaged a deeper, more primal layer of human fear. Why do these non-visual elements make a frightening concept so persistent? A terrifying image can be closed out by shutting your eyes, but a sound, a scent, a sudden chill on the skin, these sensations seep into your environment. They make the world itself feel haunted. By associating specific sensory triggers with their monsters, ancient storytellers transformed entire landscapes into stages for horror. The forest was no longer just trees, it was the domain of the Vela's song. The quiet of night was no longer peace, it was the potential silence before the banshee's cry. This multisensory genius ensured these creatures were not just remembered as pictures in the mind, but as feelings in the body, lingering long after the story was over, waiting for a familiar sound or a sudden chill to bring the fear rushing back. A monster's shadow was not cast just to frighten, but to guide. Beyond the primal terror, these ancient creations served a higher purpose as moral compasses, their stories carefully engineered to reinforce the very fabric of society. They were narrative tools for social order, teaching vital lessons about right and wrong through the stark consequences of encountering their wrath. Consider the Babylonian epic of creation, where the goddess Tiamat, a monstrous embodiment of primordial chaos, wages war against the younger gods. She is not merely a beast to be slain. She is the swirling, undifferentiated void of the world before order existed. Her defeat at the hands of the god Marduk is a foundational myth, a cosmic story where civilization itself is literally built from her divided body. Marduk uses her corpse to fashion the heavens and the earth. This was not simple storytelling. It was a powerful cultural metaphor reinforcing the ultimate value of order over chaos, of structured society over the formless deep. The monster's destruction was a necessary act to create and sustain the world as they knew it. Far across the ocean, the Aztec Itzimime star demons served a similar, if more immediate, social function. These skeletal beings were believed to descend from the sky to devour humanity during the terrifying moments of a solar eclipse. This myth was not just an explanation for a celestial event. It was a powerful engine for community cohesion and ritual observance. The fear of the Itzimime compelled the people to perform the necessary ceremonies, prayers, and sacrifices to ensure the sun would return. Their monstrous presence directly encouraged the behaviors that kept the community united and in harmony with the cosmic order. What do these monsters reveal about the values of their creators? The specific fears they embodied often mirrored the greatest taboos or the most desired virtues of their time. A monster that punished greed taught the value of generosity. A creature that preyed on oath-breakers reinforced the sanctity of one's word. They were functional components of cultural education, transforming abstract moral codes into vivid, unforgettable narratives. This moral dimension reveals a profound truth. Fear was not just a raw emotion to be exploited. It was a tool deliberately harnessed for social engineering, shaping behavior and binding communities together with stories that were far more powerful than any written law. These stories of moral guardians were not confined to the mind. They were carved into the very stone of daily life. The artistry of fear found its ultimate expression in physical form, using the most precious and durable materials available to make the monstrous tangible. In Mesopotamia, intricate cylinder seals, used to roll impressions into clay for administrative documents, were often carved with the images of lion demons and other hybrid creatures. This meant that every time a merchant sealed a contract or a scribe recorded a transaction, they were literally stamping the symbol of a monster onto the paperwork of their civilization. The supernatural was woven directly into the fabric of commerce and law, a constant, subtle reminder of the cosmic forces that underpinned their orderly world. Far to the east, Chinese artisans performed a similar alchemy with jade. They carved elaborate dragon motifs into this incredibly hard, precious stone, transforming a geological treasure into a vessel of immense spiritual power. A jade dragon pendant was not merely jewelry. It was a concentrated piece of cosmic order, an amulet that harnessed the dragon's control over rain and fertility for the wearer's protection and benefit. The immense labor required to carve jade reflected the cultural importance of the symbol itself. This was artistry in service of ritual, blending aesthetic beauty with profound spiritual function. How does giving a monster physical form change its impact on a society? The transition from a story told around a fire to an object held in the hand represents a crucial step in institutionalizing fear. A mental concept is fluid and personal. A physical idol, seal, or amulet is a shared communal focal point. It allows a society to curate and control its fears, to ritualize the relationship with the monstrous through offerings, displays, and ceremonies. The choice of material spoke volumes. Durable stone and metal implied the monster was a permanent, everlasting force to be reckoned with. Precious jade and gold signaled that the creature was a power of immense value, worthy of the finest offerings. By rendering their terrors in physical form, ancient cultures did not just make them more real. They made them manageable, turning abstract dread into a concrete element of their daily ritual and identity. Stone and myth became one in the hands of ancient architects. They moved beyond carving small amulets and began to weave monstrous imagery directly into the bones of their cities, transforming entire buildings into permanent reminders of the supernatural. This was not mere decoration. It was a deliberate strategy to shape human experience through the built environment. The gargoyles perched high on medieval European cathedrals are a perfect fusion of function and fear. These grotesque stone creatures served a brilliantly practical purpose, their open mouths acting as waterspouts to channel rainwater away from the delicate masonry. But their function went far beyond hydraulics. Their grimacing faces and twisted forms stared down at the populace, serving as a constant, silent warning against evil spirits and moral transgressions. The church was not just a place of solace, it was a fortress against darkness, and its grotesque guardians made that defense visible to all. The psychological protection was as vital as the physical. Across the Atlantic, Mayan architects achieved a similar effect with profound spiritual resonance. The facades of their towering temples were often dominated by enormous, monstrous masks depicting deities like Chok, the god of rain and lightning. To approach such a structure was to walk directly into the gaping mouth of the divine. The building itself became the god's living presence, a constant reminder that survival depended on the favor of these powerful, temperamental beings. This architectural choice made the sacred space feel awake and powerful, a direct conduit to forces that controlled the weather and the harvest. How does this integration change our relationship with fear? When monsters are no longer confined to stories or small objects, but instead frame the doorways and line the rooftops of your daily life, fear becomes ambient. It is baked into the landscape, A walk through the city becomes a journey through a mythological narrative where every shadowy corner might hold a carved demon and every grand plaza might be watched by a stone god. This environmental approach ensured that the lessons of the myth, the presence of the divine, and the threat of chaos were inescapable parts of civic life. The very stones you walked on were teaching you, warning you, and watching you, making the mythology of a culture as real and tangible as the ground beneath your feet. The written word became a portal into terror. Ancient scribes and poets were master architects of fear, using sophisticated literary techniques to build suspense and horror with nothing but ink and parchment. The way a monster was introduced in a story could be just as frightening as the creature itself. Homer's Odyssey offers a brilliant lesson in this slow burn approach. When Odysseus and his men enter the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus, the horror unfolds in stages. They first notice the enormous size of the dwelling, the massive cheese racks, and the giant milking pails. The audience feels a growing dread long before the giant shepherd himself returns. This gradual revelation forces us to piece together the threat, making the final, horrifying reveal of the one-eyed monster all the more impactful. The pacing is deliberate, turning the cave from a place of curiosity into a claustrophobic trap. This was not just describing a monster, it was building an experience. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the monster Humbaba serves a different narrative purpose. He is the guardian of the sacred cedar forest, and his real power lies in what he represents. He is not merely a strange beast, he is the living embodiment of the terrifying, primeval unknown. The forest itself is a character, dark and forbidding, and Humbaba is its spirit. Defeating him is not just a physical battle, it is a symbolic conquest of nature's wild, untamable heart. The poet uses vivid, terrifying language to describe his roar as a flood, his mouth as death, and his breath as fire. This poetic framing elevates Humbaba from a simple obstacle into a profound representation of humanity's struggle against a chaotic natural world. How does this literary framing make a monster so much more potent? A story gives a creature context, motivation, and a relationship to the hero and the world. We do not just see the monster, we feel its impact. We experience the hero's fear, the tightening tension as they approach its lair, and the profound relief or tragedy that follows the encounter. The choice of perspective is crucial. Telling the story from the hero's limited point of view forces the audience to share in their uncertainty and dread. The true artistry was in understanding that a monster's power was not just in its claws or fangs, but in the story built around it. These ancient narratives transformed simple beasts into complex mirrors, reflecting our deepest struggles against nature, against fate, and against the limitations of our own courage. The pen proved mightier than the sword, not by describing a nightmare, but by making the reader live inside one. A myth chiseled into stone is powerful, but a myth that walks and breathes among you is terrifying. Ancient civilizations perfected this final step in their artistry of fear by bringing their monsters to life through ritual and performance. These were not simple plays for entertainment. They were sacred ceremonies, communal reenactments where the abstract terror of a myth was given a body, a voice, and a physical presence in the heart of the city. In Egypt, the chaotic power of the god Seth was not just a story told in temples. During specific rituals, priests would don elaborate animal masks, becoming living vessels for his destructive essence. They would engage in symbolic battles, reenacting the eternal struggle against disorder. For the spectators, this was not a performance in the modern sense. It was a moment where the divine and the mortal worlds collided. The priest was no longer just a man, he was the embodiment of chaos itself, moving through their midst. This blurred line between actor and deity generated a palpable, collective awe, transforming a theological concept into a visceral, shared experience. Across the globe, the Aztecs elevated this practice to a breathtaking scale. During festivals tied to solar cycles, performers dressed as the skeletal Itzamime star demons would descend the steep steps of their massive pyramids. They were not just representing the demons, they were channeling them, moving directly into the crowds during the fearful moments of an eclipse when the sun was threatened. The terror was not abstract, it was sensory. You could see their skeletal forms against the darkened sky. You could hear the rustle of their costumes. You could feel the collective gasp of the crowd. This was myth as public reality, a direct intervention of the monstrous into daily life designed to reinforce a cosmic truth. What happens when myth steps off the page and into the streets? It becomes inescapable. Ritual theater made the monstrous tangible and unforgettable because it required the entire community to participate, not just as an audience, but as believers in a living story. The fear was harnessed, directed, and ultimately used to bind everyone together in a shared understanding of their world, its dangers, and their place within it. The design of a monster is never truly finished. It evolves, shedding one skin and growing another as the society that created it confronts new horizons. The earliest Sumerian demons were stark and direct in their purpose. Pazuzu, the king of the wind demons, was a terrifying figure with a canine face, scaly body, and monstrous claws. But his role was specific, to ward off other evil spirits, particularly the malevolent Lamashtu. He was a functional terror, a representation of a specific natural force and its dangerous, yet sometimes necessary, power. His form was a direct response to the immediate and brutal realities of life in an unforgiving landscape. Centuries later, the monsters of the Greco-Roman world exhibited a profound shift. They became less about external environmental threats and more about the internal landscapes of the human soul. Medusa's curse was a tragedy born of violation. The Hydra was not just a multi-headed beast, but a problem that grew worse with every attempt to solve it. The Minotaur, trapped in its labyrinth, was a monstrous reflection of shame, secrecy, and the brutal cost of broken oaths. These creatures were psychological puzzles, their horror rooted in moral failings and complex emotional truths. The artistry of fear had turned inward. This transformation accelerated as civilizations collided. Trade routes and conquests became conduits for nightmares, blending local terrors into new hybrid forms. When Alexander the Great's armies marched into India, they brought back tales and artistic influences that slowly seeped into the mythology of the Mediterranean. The Greek idea of a monstrous, wild man began to merge with descriptions of exotic creatures from the East. The fears of one culture were grafted onto the unknown lands of another, creating monsters that were maps of intercultural contact and conflict. A creature born in this era was not just a beast, it was a story of exploration, of the fear of the other, and of a world that was suddenly, terrifyingly, much larger. How do shifting historical circumstances reshape our nightmares? They act as a relentless pressure, forcing the symbols of our anxiety to adapt or become obsolete. A society mastering bronze weaponry might fear a dragon with impenetrable scales. That same society, centuries later, grappling with the complexities of empire and personal morality, would create monsters that challenge the spirit, not just the spear. The continuous redesign of these mythological creatures reveals fear not as a static primal scream, but as a responsive, evolving cultural artifact. It is a dialogue between a people and their perception of the world, a conversation written in the language of claws, fangs, and haunting, ever-changing forms. A world away, a civilization creates a water serpent almost identical to one from a land it could never have known. This is not a coincidence, it is a clue. When we place the monsters of ancient Mesopotamia beside those of ancient India or Greece, a startling pattern emerges. Entirely separate cultures with no contact, designed nearly identical creatures to represent the same fundamental fears. The terrifying power of water is a perfect example. The Mesopotamian Tiamat was a primordial goddess of the saltwater ocean, a chaotic force of creation and destruction. The Hebrew Leviathan was a twisting, coiling sea serpent of immense power, a symbol of the untamable deep. In Hindu traditions, the Makara, a mythical sea creature often part crocodile and part elephant, served as the vehicle for the river goddess Ganga and a symbol of the water's life-giving yet dangerous nature. Each of these cultures, living near great bodies of water, personified its dual capacity for sustenance and annihilation into a singular, formidable monster. The design changed, but the core fear remained the same. The same pattern holds for the ultimate unknown, death itself. The gateway to the afterlife was almost universally guarded by a monstrous canine. The Greeks had Cerberus, the multi-headed hound who ensured no one left the underworld. The Egyptians had Ammit, the devourer of the dead, who awaited souls that failed their final judgment. In Norse myth, the blood-stained hound Garma stood bound at the entrance to Hell's realm, waiting to howl at the start of Ragnarok. A dog's natural instincts to guard and be loyal are here twisted into a terrifying, eternal vigilance. Why would cultures spanning continents all station a beast at the border of death? It reflects a shared human need to conceptualize the transition from life to whatever comes next, to give a face to the final, impassable threshold. The variations in these designs are just as revealing as the similarities. A culture that practiced elaborate burial rites and mummification, like the Egyptians, created a monster focused on the moral weight of a life, a final judge. A culture of warriors and heroes, like the Greeks, imagined a guardian that prevented escape, making the land of the dead a one-way journey. The specific form of the fear was molded by local values, but the underlying terror of mortality itself was a universal human experience. What does this convergent evolution of monsters tell us? It points to a deep structure of the human psyche. Certain experiences are so fundamental to the human condition, like the fear of drowning, the dread of the dark, or the anxiety about what happens after we die, that they demand a physical shape. Our ancestors, working in isolation, reached for the same symbolic tools to build that shape. The monster is not just a cultural artifact, it is a psychological one, a shared blueprint for fear written into our collective mind. A monster's true power often lay in the details left untold. Ancient creators understood that a precisely defined creature could eventually be mapped, understood, and perhaps even defeated. But a monster shrouded in strategic mystery was a threat that never truly faded. This final design principle weaponized the unknown, crafting beings whose terrifying essence was their very incomprehensibility. Long before Lovecraft penned his cosmic horrors, the Mesopotamian Apkallu sages walked the line between knowledge and terror. These figures were often depicted as birdmen with human bodies and the heads of eagles. But their descriptions were left deliberately powerfully vague. Were they benevolent bringers of civilization or ancient, non-human entities from a time before the flood? This ambiguity was their strength. By withholding a clear moral alignment or a definitive origin, the mythmakers allowed each generation to project its own anxieties onto them. They became a canvas for fear, their silence more haunting than any roar. The Celtic Fomorians perfected this same unsettling technique. They were the chaotic, monstrous inhabitants of Ireland, yet their forms were never fixed. Some texts describe them as having animal features, others as misshapen giants, and still others as possessing a single arm and leg. This lack of a consistent physical description was not a flaw in the mythology, it was its core feature. The Fomorians were not a specific type of creature, they were the very embodiment of otherness. You could not prepare for them because you never knew exactly what they were. Their shifting nature made them fundamentally unpredictable, a force of chaos that refused to be neatly categorized. So why does this deliberate ambiguity work so deeply on our minds? The human brain is a pattern recognition machine desperate to make sense of the world. When confronted with a monster whose shape, motives, or origins are left unclear, that cognitive machinery spins in vain. The fear of the incomprehensible is more profound than the fear of a claw or a fang, because it suggests a universe that does not obey our logic. How does what we don't know about a monster become more frightening than what we do? The gaps in the description become a playground for our own personal fears, allowing the creature to evolve and adapt long after its story was first told. This design for uncertainty ensured that these ancient monsters could never be truly solved, only feared, their shadows growing longer with every unanswered question. The most intimate terror is the one that wears your own face. After exploring monsters of immense scale and unsettling hybrid forms, ancient mythologies zeroed in on an even more personal fear, the terror of an unstable self. This was the domain of the Shapeshifter, a monster whose very essence was change, embodying the deep-seated anxiety that identity itself was not a fixed state, but a fragile mask that could be stolen or shattered. The Greek sea god Proteus was a master of this unsettling art. He was a herdsman of seals, an entity who knew all things past, present, and future. But to get this knowledge, you had to catch him, and he would not be held. The moment you laid hands on him, he would begin a frantic, dazzling metamorphosis, shifting from a lion to a serpent, from a panther to a torrent of water, and finally to a towering tree. His power was not in a single terrifying form, but in his refusal to have one. He represented the fundamental fear of deception, the idea that reality itself was fluid, and that truth was a slippery thing that would constantly change its shape to escape your grasp. Across the Atlantic, the Navajo and other Native American traditions held a similar, profound dread of transformation in the legend of the Skinwalker. This was not a god but a human, a witch who had gained the malevolent power to assume the form of an animal. The horror here was not just the change itself, but the violation of a sacred boundary. It blurred the line between human and beast, suggesting that a person could shed their humanity like a coat, revealing a predatory inner nature. The Skinwalker was the ultimate betrayer, a neighbor who might secretly be a wolf, a friend who could be a crow listening from the rafters. This tapped into a chilling paranoia about the true nature of those around you. Why would the fear of transformation be so universally potent? It strikes at the core of how we understand our own existence. We build our lives on certain constants, the solid ground of our bodies, our memories, our social roles. A shape-shifting monster declares that all of this is negotiable. Your trusted advisor could be a monster in disguise. The animal hunting you in the woods could be your vengeful uncle. This made the threat impossible to guard against because it refused to obey the basic categories you used to navigate the world. The true horror of these creatures was not the form they took, but the terrifying possibility that the self was not a fortress, but a doorway, one that could be opened from the inside by a malevolent will, or from the outside by a force you could never hope to understand. Fear could be carved into the very architecture of power. When rulers and priests harnessed the deep-seated dread of monsters, they transformed myth into a tool for social and political control, engineering a world where obedience was the only safe path. The great Assyrian palaces were not just royal residences, they were psychological fortresses. Their gateways were flanked by colossal stone figures known as lamashu, creatures with the bearded head of a wise king, the powerful body of a bull or lion, and the majestic wings of an eagle. These were not monsters of pure terror, but hybrid guardians designed to inspire a very specific feeling, a blend of awe and submission. They symbolized a king's divine right to rule, a power so absolute it was protected by supernatural beings. To stand before a lamashu was to understand that the state was watched over by forces beyond human challenge, making dissent feel like a sin against the cosmic order. Across the world, Chinese emperors perfected this same principle with a different symbol. The dragon, a creature of immense power over rain and the heavens, was co-opted as the exclusive emblem of the emperor himself. His throne was the dragon throne, his robes were dragon robes. This was a brilliant political maneuver, equating the ruler's authority with a fundamental, life-giving force of nature. To rebel against the emperor was not merely a political crime, it was to disrupt the cosmic balance, to risk bringing drought and famine upon the entire kingdom. The monster became a symbol of legitimacy, and fear of chaos kept the population in line. How does this institutionalized mythology serve power structures? It externalizes the source of authority. The king is not just a man making laws, he is the representative of the dragon's will or the lamashu's protected charge. This makes his power seem predestined and unchangeable, a fact of the universe as real as the sun rising. The artistry here was in crafting monsters that served a dual purpose, offering protection to the populace while simultaneously threatening divine retribution for any who challenged the status quo. This calculated deployment of fear reveals a dark alchemy, where the raw material of human anxiety was refined into the most durable foundation for social control, ensuring that the authority of the ruler was felt not just in his laws, but in the very monsters that guarded the city gates. The monster's lair was an extension of its very being. Ancient creators knew that a truly terrifying creature needed a home that amplified its horror, a stage set for maximum psychological impact. The Greek labyrinth was far more than a maze built to contain the Minotaur. It was a physical manifestation of the beast's own savage and confused nature. Its twisting, identical corridors were designed to strip away reason and hope, leaving victims lost and utterly vulnerable long before they ever encountered the monster waiting at its heart. The environment itself did the work of softening the prey, making the Minotaur's final, brutal appearance feel like an inevitability. This was a space engineered for despair. Mesopotamian mythmakers employed a different kind of environmental terror. They consistently placed their demons and chaotic beings in liminal spaces, the uncertain thresholds that marked the edge of the civilized world. Deserts, deep oceans, and distant, inaccessible mountains were not just dangerous places. They were the unknown, the uncharted territories where the normal rules of society and nature no longer applied. To venture into these zones was to step outside the protection of the gods and into the direct dominion of monsters. A demon from the desert wind or a creature from the abyssal sea carried the terror of its homeland with it. How does place become part of the monster's power? It acts as a psychological multiplier. A giant is frightening, but a giant standing at the top of a mountain you cannot climb is a god. A serpent is dangerous, but a serpent that moves through pitch-black, tangled roots where you cannot see or run becomes an inescapable phantom. The habitat and the horror were a single, cohesive ecosystem. The environment mirrored the monster's essential nature, and the monster, in turn, gave a malevolent consciousness to the environment's inherent dangers. This design created a fully immersive Chinese letter experience where the very air, the very ground beneath your feet, was an active participant in the fear. You were not just being hunted, you were being consumed by a landscape that had been purpose-built for your dread. A monster's voice could shake the very foundations of the sky. Beyond the terrifying forms and shifting shapes, ancient cultures designed their creatures with chilling sonic identities, weaponizing sound itself to create a fear that felt both immediate and inescapable. The Hebrew ziz, a colossal bird of myth whose wingspan was said to blot out the sun, possessed a cry of pure cosmic dread. Its call was not just loud, it was transformative, a shriek that could literally darken the sun. This was not a simple animal noise. It was auditory evidence of the creature's power to disrupt the natural order, linking the terror of its voice directly to the ultimate celestial disruption. The sound was the herald of chaos. In stark contrast, the Japanese yumabazu wielded a different, equally terrifying auditory weapon: silence. This monstrous sea spirit would rise from calm waters to confront sailors, and its arrival was preceded by a sudden, profound, and unnatural stillness. The lapping waves would cease, the wind would die, and the world would become eerily mute. This absence of sound was not peace. It was a vacuum of dread, a sensory deprivation that signaled imminent attack. The silence itself was the monster's first blow, heightening anxiety and paralyzing its victims before it even revealed its full form. Why does a sound, or its deliberate absence, carve such a deep groove of fear in our minds? Visual threats are confined to a line of sight, but a sound travels. It wraps around corners, it penetrates walls, it finds you in the dark. By giving their monsters these distinct sonic signatures, ancient storytellers ensured they were detectable through means other than sight, expanding their haunting presence beyond the merely visual realm. The specific sound assigned to a creature was never arbitrary. A shriek that blotted out the sun perfectly matched a beast that challenged the heavens. A predatory silence on the ocean mirrored the sudden, unexpected danger of a squall emerging from a calm sea. This auditory dimension completed the monster, making it a multi-sensory event that lived not just in the stories, but in the very air the people breathed, waiting for a familiar cry or an unnatural quiet to bring the ancient terror rushing back. The fear of being eaten is a terror written into our very bones. Long before cities or stories, this dread was a constant companion in the dark, a survival instinct screaming that to be consumed was the final end. Ancient cultures masterfully channeled this primal anxiety into their most visceral monsters, transforming the abstract terror of annihilation into a creature with a gaping maw. The Greek monster Scylla perfectly captured the sudden, arbitrary violence of the natural world. Lurking in a narrow sea channel, she was not a single horror but a multiplied one. From her cavern, 6 long, serpentine necks would strike, each tipped with a ravenous head that would pluck sailors directly from the deck of their ship. Her attack was swift, personal, and utterly random. She represented the specific fear of maritime disaster, the understanding that the sea could snatch you away in an instant without warning or reason, turning a journey into a tragedy. Far across the world, the Aztecs envisioned a devourer of a far greater scale. Cipactli was a primordial monster, a chaotic being often described as part crocodile, part fish, covered with hungry mouths at every joint. This creature existed before time, in the formless waters that preceded creation. Its defining trait was an insatiable, endless hunger. Cipactli was not just eating people, it was consuming reality itself, symbolizing the chaotic void that constantly threatened to devour the fragile order of the world. The gods themselves had to defeat and tear apart Cipactli to use its body as the foundation for the earth and sky. This myth elevated the fear of consumption from a personal danger to a cosmic one. Why does the image of the devourer hold such universal power? It taps into the most fundamental equation of existence, the stark line between being and nothingness. To be eaten is to be erased, assimilated into the body of another, leaving no trace behind. These monsters gave a face to every uncontrollable appetite that threatened to consume order and safety, from the literal hunger of a predator to the symbolic consumption by a plague, a famine, or even an overwhelming social obligation. The devouring monster was the ultimate symbol of loss, a walking, hungry reminder of how easily a single life could be swallowed by the vast, indifferent darkness. A monster's terrifying form could be turned outward, transforming it from a threat into a shield. This fascinating duality reveals how ancient societies weaponized fear for protection, designing creatures whose very horror was a public service. The Egyptian Sphinx stands as a masterwork of this defensive artistry, with the powerful body of a lion and the intelligent, watchful face of a pharaoh. It was not a creature to be slain, but one to be respected. Stationed at the entrance to temples and pyramids, its immense stone form served as a permanent, unblinking sentinel. Its message was clear to any who approached, whether grave robber or evil spirit. The immense physical power of the lion was now fused with the divine authority of a ruler, creating a guardian that protected sacred space by inspiring a deep and calculated dread. The fear it generated was not meant to paralyze the common person, but to deter the malevolent, channeling terror into a force for communal security. Within the Roman home, a different kind of protective monster watched over the hearth. The Lairs were household guardian spirits, often represented by small, sometimes grotesque figurines placed in family shrines. These were not beautiful cherubs, but beings with an unsettling, otherworldly quality. Their monstrous aspects were not a flaw, they were a feature. It was believed that their fearsome countenance could frighten away darker, more destructive forces. They were the spiritual equivalent of a guard dog, their perceived ferocity serving as a deterrent against the invisible dangers that might threaten the family's health and prosperity. How can something frightening become a source of security? The answer lies in the redirection of threat. A community could not control every external danger, from invading armies to unexplained illnesses. But by creating a designated monster as an ally, they could psychologically reframe the landscape of fear. The Sphinx and the Lairs were not the true danger, they were the terrifying solution to a greater, more formless terror. Their presence created a defined boundary, a line that said here, within this temple or this home, you are under the protection of a power formidable enough to frighten away even the shadows. This brilliant pivot in design shows that the ancient artistry of fear was not just about creating nightmares, but about building a world where some nightmares worked for you. Numbers themselves could become instruments of terror. Beyond the claws and the scales, ancient artisans embedded mathematical precision into their monsters, using sacred geometry and symbolic proportions to create a deeper, more intellectual kind of dread. This was not random multiplication. It was a deliberate design choice to make the unnatural feel systematic and inescapable. The Greek monster Typhon, the father of all monsters, was not described as having many snake heads. The myths are chillingly specific, giving him exactly 100 serpents coiled at his shoulders. This round, complete number was not a casual detail. It transformed him from a chaotic beast into an overwhelming, calculated force. One snake is a threat. 100 is a system, a legion, a problem that cannot be solved through simple combat. The number itself communicates an impossible, exhaustive struggle. This same mathematical artistry appears in the Hindu goddess Kali. She is often depicted with multiple arms, typically 4, 8, or 10. Each count holds deep numerological meaning, with 4 arms representing her dominion over the 4 directions or the 4 primary aims of human life. But visually, this creates a profoundly disturbing image. The human brain expects 2 arms, seeing 4 or 8, all moving independently and holding different weapons or symbols creates a cognitive dissonance. She becomes a being of impossible, simultaneous action, a figure who can grant boons and deliver destruction in the same instant, leaving no room for defense or appeal. How does this mathematical precision amplify fear? It adds a layer of intellectual horror to the visceral shock. A random beast is frightening, but a monster built on a mathematical or geometric principle suggests a terrifying order to the chaos. It implies the creature is not an accident, but a part of the universe's fundamental, albeit frightening, architecture. the monster feels intentional, designed, and therefore far more permanent and powerful. This numerical dimension made these ancient horrors feel like they belonged to a cosmos that was both ordered and terrifying, a universe where the very mathematics of creation could be weaponized against humanity. Color was a silent language in the art of fear. Ancient creators painted their monsters with a deliberate palette, using hues that carried immediate, visceral meaning to their audience, transforming a simple image into a layered psychological trigger. The Egyptian demon Ammit, the devourer of unjust souls, was frequently rendered with stark black skin. This was not an arbitrary choice. In the Egyptian worldview, black was the color of the fertile Nile silt, the rich mud that flooded the plains each year, bringing both life-giving nourishment and the constant cycle of decay. By painting Ammit black, artists directly associated her with this duality, the necessary death that fed new life, making her a fundamental part of the cosmic order. Her darkness was not just the void of death, but the fertile, terrifying soil from which the afterlife grew. Across the ocean, the Mesoamerican feathered serpent god Kukulkan wore a very different but equally potent color. His form was adorned with the radiant, iridescent green feathers of the Quetzal bird. This specific green was more than just beautiful, it was profoundly symbolic. The vibrant color represented the lushness of maize plants, the lifeblood of their civilization, and the jade stone that was more precious than gold. To see Kukulkan's green scales was to see the embodiment of agricultural fertility and divine kingship, a monster whose color promised life and prosperity as much as it commanded awe. These choices were far from decorative. They were a form of visual shorthand that anyone in that culture would instantly understand. The emotional impact of a monster was deeply tied to its color. A red demon might evoke the rage of fire and blood, while a pale, white specter could call forth the chill of a corpse. How does color transform our emotional response? It bypasses conscious thought and taps directly into our learned associations. A creature of putrid green feels sickly and corrupt. A being of brilliant gold feels untouchable and divine. The limited availability of pigments in the ancient world made each color choice even more significant. Using a rare and expensive color like Egyptian blue or the vibrant green from crushed malachite was a statement in itself, reserved for beings of the highest importance and power. This chromatic dimension added a subtle yet powerful layer to the monster's design, ensuring that even before a viewer understood the creature's story, they felt its meaning through the silent, potent language of color. A monster that refuses to die is a story that never ends. This fear of endless proliferation lies at the heart of the next design principle, where ancient artists engineered creatures whose very biology was a form of terror. They gave their monsters the terrifying ability to reproduce, regenerate, and outlast any single hero, embodying the deep-seated anxiety that some evils are not just powerful but self-perpetuating. The Greek Hydra is the ultimate symbol of this dread. For every one of its serpentine heads that was severed, 2 more would grow back in its place. This was not a simple physical trait, it was a brilliant narrative device. The Hydra represented the nature of a problem that multiplies when you try to solve it through brute force. A political rebellion, a spreading plague, a tangled family feud. Each attempt to cut it down only makes it stronger and more complex. The hero Hercules could only defeat it with a strategy that involved cauterizing the necks, a metaphor for addressing the root cause rather than just the symptoms. The monster's reproduction was its primary weapon, turning a battle into an exponentially growing nightmare. Meanwhile, in the frozen north, the Norse Midgard serpent Jörmungandr presented a different kind of lasting threat. Prophecy declared that this world-circling beast would not only be slain by the god Thor during Ragnarok, but that Thor would then succumb to its venom and die. More chilling still, the myth suggests that after the world is destroyed and reborn, a new cycle would begin. The serpent, or a creature like it, would return. This was not a monster you could defeat for good. It was an inescapable part of the cosmic order, a force of destruction that was guaranteed to outlive the current world and haunt the next one. Its legacy was its power, creating a narrative of inevitable, repeating catastrophe. Why does the fear of something that will not stay dead resonate across centuries? It touches on our most profound anxieties about the future. A single threat, no matter how large, can be faced with courage, but a threat that can regenerate, that can spawn endless copies of itself, or that is destined to return in another age, creates a feeling of futility. It speaks to the fear of endless conflict, the persistence of evil across generations, and the haunting idea that the struggles of today will simply be inherited by our children. This focus on monstrous legacy transformed these creatures from mere obstacles into timeless forces, ensuring their stories would be told and retold, not as tales of past victories, but as warnings of cyclical dangers that sleep but never truly die. The monster's gaze was a loaded weapon, turning the simple act of looking into a potentially fatal mistake. In the ancient world, vision was not a passive sense. It was understood as an active force, a beam of influence that reached out from the eye to touch the world. This belief gave rise to the evil eye and the power of the curse, concepts that ancient mythmakers weaponized in their most terrifying creations. The Greek basilisk, the king of serpents, was the ultimate expression of this principle. Its mere glance was lethal, a poison delivered through the air directly to the soul of anyone who met its eyes. This was not just a monster you could fight, it was a creature you could not even witness without dying. It represented the terrifying idea that some truths, some forms of knowledge or power, were so dangerous that to perceive them was to be destroyed. The basilisk made curiosity itself a fatal flaw. Across Europe, the Celtic giant Balor of the Evil Eye wielded a similar, though more controlled, visual horror. His single eye was so destructive that it had to be kept veiled behind multiple layers of eyelid. In battle, his attendants would pry these lids open with hooks, unleashing a beam of pure annihilation that would obliterate whatever it fell upon. Balor's power was not constant, it was a spectacle, a deliberate unleashing of a force so potent it had to be physically restrained. This design transformed the monster into a living siege weapon, but one that carried a profound psychological warning about the dangers of unrestrained, malevolent vision. How does making sight dangerous transform our relationship with the world? It forces a state of constant vigilance and paranoia. You can no longer trust your own senses. A beautiful statue in a temple courtyard might be a gorgon. A giant sleeping on a distant hill might be Balor, one twitch of an eyelid away from erasing you from existence. The environment becomes a minefield of potential glances, where every shadowed corner or reflective surface could hold a deadly visual trap. This design principle weaponized the most fundamental tool we use to navigate reality, our sight, making the world itself a place where to see was to risk everything. Even the most perfectly designed monster needed a fatal flaw. Ancient storytellers understood that a truly compelling narrative required more than just a terrifying antagonist. It needed the possibility of victory. This was the final, crucial layer in their artistry of fear, the deliberate engineering of a monster's weakness. These vulnerabilities were not simple oversights. They were moral and philosophical arguments woven into the very fabric of the myth, turning a tale of horror into a lesson on how to survive it. Consider the Gorgon Medusa. Her power was absolute, a gaze that turned living flesh to stone. To look upon her was to die, yet her defeat came not from a stronger force, but from a clever trick. The hero Perseus used a polished shield as a mirror, allowing him to see her reflection without meeting her eyes directly. He turned her own greatest weapon against her. This was not a victory of strength, but one of intellect and ingenuity. It taught a powerful lesson that some of the most formidable threats in life cannot be confronted head-on, but must be outsmarted. The symbolic victory was clear. Human cunning could overcome even the most petrifying and rigid forms of evil. In the frozen realms of Norse mythology, a different kind of weakness was exploited. The frost giants were elemental beings of ice and storm, embodiments of the chaotic, untamable wild that constantly threatened the ordered world of the gods. Their defeat was often tied to the god Thor and his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, a weapon that channeled the power of lightning and thunder. Fire and lightning, the fundamental tools of early civilization, were the perfect counter to the primal chaos of the giants' icy domain. This weakness was deeply symbolic, representing how human innovation, the control of fire and the forging of metal, could push back the encroaching wilderness and secure a space for society to thrive. Why was this design principle of the Achilles heel so vital? It transformed paralyzing fear into manageable dread. A monster with no weakness is a force of nature, an inevitability that offers no hope. But a monster with a specific, discoverable flaw becomes a puzzle. It invites the hero, and by extension the audience, to engage. The story shifts from a simple description of terror to an active problem-solving exercise. This crucial element made the myths functionally educational. They were not just telling people to be afraid of the dark, they were teaching them how to light a candle. The monster's weakness was the key to that flame, a carefully placed narrative instruction that said no matter how powerful the terror, there is always a path, however narrow, to overcome it. The digital age did not invent horror, it simply gave it a new canvas. The same artistic principles that gave us the Gorgon and the Hydra are now hard at work in our movies and video games. Modern creature designers are the spiritual descendants of those ancient mythmakers, still stitching together animal and human traits to provoke that same deep-seated unease. Think of the creature from the film The Thing, a being that has no single form but endlessly assimilates and hybridizes the bodies it encounters. Its very existence is a violation of biological categories, creating the same cognitive dissonance that made the Chimera so terrifying. Or consider the grotesque clickers from the game The Last of Us, whose humanoid forms are violently corrupted by fungal growths. They are a direct echo of the Gorgons, presenting a hauntingly human shape that has been monstrously twisted, forcing us to see a reflection of ourselves in the horror. This is not a coincidence. It is the continued application of a blueprint for fear that is thousands of years old. Game designers have also mastered the ancient art of environmental dread. The Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil or the ruined city of Ihanom in Bloodborne are not just backdrops. They are modern labyrinths, carefully constructed spaces that use shadow, sound, and architecture to amplify anxiety long before a monster ever appears. Just as the Minotaur's maze was an extension of its chaotic nature, these digital environments are active participants in the horror, shaping your experience and manipulating your emotions with every creaking floorboard and distant, unseen groan. Why do these age-old techniques feel just as potent on a screen as they did carved into temple stone? The psychological underpinnings are identical. We still fear the loss of self, the violation of our bodies, and the predatory unknown. Modern creators, often without even realizing it, are tapping into the same symbolic language that our ancestors used to give shape to their deepest anxieties. The pixels and special effects are new, but the nightmares they depict are ancient. This unbroken lineage proves that the most powerful monsters are not bound by the era of their creation. They are timeless because they speak to something fundamental within us all, a shared human psychology that transcends the centuries. The artistry of fear is a tradition that has simply been passed down, from the hands that carved amulets to the hands that code virtual worlds.